something on the camera. From the chapter on Temperance, I believe. Second section, Josef Pieper, the Four Cardinal Virtues, on the Christian Aristotelianism of St. Thomas Aquinas. Selfless self-preservation. Aquinas says that the second meaning of temperance is serenity of the spirit, quies animi. It is obvious that this proposition does not imply a purely subjective state of mental calm. There we go. Let's do it like that. Let's do it that way. Yeah. And again, got like the brightest possible light, like right there, like key eye, right in your freaking face. There we go. I have no idea why it's so bright, actually. That's so weird looking. All right. It is obvious that this proposition does not imply a purely subjective state of mental calm or the tranquil satisfaction, which is the byproduct of an unassuming, leisurely life in a narrow circle. Nor does it mean a mere absence of irritation or dispassionate equanimity. All this need not go deeper than the surface of the intellectual and spiritual life. What is meant is the serenity that fills the inmost recesses of the human being and is the seal and fruit of order. The purpose and goal of temperament, is man's inner order, from which alone this serenity of spirit can flow forth. Temperance signifies the realizing of this order within oneself. Temperamentia is distinguished from the other cardinal virtues by the fact that it refers exclusively to the active man himself. Prudence, prudentia, looks to all existent reality. Justice, justitia, to the fellow man. The man of fortitude relinquishes in self-forgetfulness his own possessions and his life. Temperance, on the other hand, aims at each man himself. Temperance implies that man should look to himself and his condition, that his vision and his will should be focused on himself. That notion that the primordial images of all things reside in God has been applied by Aquinas to the cardinal virtues also. The primordial divine mode of temperamentia, he states, is the turning of the divine spirit to itself. For man, there are two modes of this turning toward the self, a selfless and a selfish one. Only the former makes for self-preservation. The latter is destructive. In modern psychology, we find this thought. Genuine self-preservation is the turning of man toward himself, with the essential stipulation, however, that in this movement he does not become fixed upon himself. Whoever fixes his eyes upon himself gives no light. Temperance is selfless self-preservation. Intemperance is self-destruction through the self-degradation of the powers which aim at self-preservation. It is commonplace through none the less mysterious truth that the man's inner order, unlike that of the crystal, the flower, or the animal, is not a simply given and self-evident reality, but rather that the same forces from which human existence derives its being can upset that inner order to the point of destroying the spiritual and moral person. That this cleavage in human nature, provided we do not try to persuade ourselves that it does not exist, finds its explanation only in the acceptance by faith of the revealed truth of original sin, is too vast a subject to be discussed here. It seems necessary, however, to consider more closely the structure of that inner order and disorder. Most difficult to grasp is the fact that it is indeed the essential human self that is capable of throwing itself into disorder to the point of self-destruction. One more time. Most difficult to grasp is the fact that it is indeed the essential human self that is capable of throwing itself into disorder to the point of self-destruction. For man is not really a battlefield of conflicting forces and impulses which conquer one another. If we say that the sensuality in us gets the better of our reason, this is only a vague and metaphorical manner of speaking. Rather, it is always our single self that is chaste or unchaste, temperate or intemperate, self-preserving or self-destructive. It is always the decisive center of the whole, indivisible person by which the inner order is upheld or upset. It is not the good my will preserves, but the evil my will disapproves that I find myself doing. Romans 7:19. Also, the very powers of the human being, which most readily appear as the essential powers of self-preservation, self-assertion, and self-fulfillment, are at the same time the first to work the opposite, the self-destruction of the moral person. In the Summa Theologica, we find that almost uncanny formulation: the powers whose ordering is the function of temperance can most easily bring unrest to the spirit because they belong to the essence of man. But how can it be that the very powers of self-preservation are so close to becoming destructive? How can it be that the man who seeks himself can miss himself in his very seeking? And how, on the other hand, can self-love be selfless? A narrow gap of understanding is wedged open by a proposition of St. Thomas's, which may confidently be called the basis of a metaphysical philosophy of active man. It states that to love God more than himself is in accord with the natural being of man, as of every creature, and with his will as well. Consequently, the offense against the love of God derives its self-destructive sharpness from the fact that it is likewise in conflict with the nature and the natural will of man himself. If he loves nothing so much as himself, man misses and perverts with inner necessity the purpose inherent in self-love, as in all love, to preserve, to make real, to fulfill. This purpose is given only to selfless self-love, which seeks not itself blindly, but with open eyes endeavors to correspond to the true reality of God, the self, and the world. The force of this metaphysical truth, formulated by Aquinas, strikes so deep that in a sense it becomes even nonsensical to desire the preservation of the inner order for its own sake, and consequently to will even genuine self-preservation as such. That the temperamentia of the miser, who shuns debauchery because of its expense, is, as Aquinas says, no virtue, need hardly be mentioned. It is known how little, for example, a medical directive alone can do to establish true inner discipline. Not unjustly has it been said of psychotherapy, unrelated to either religion or metaphysics, that it tends to produce an anxiously fostered middle-class tranquility poisoned by its triteness, a result which evidently has nothing to do with the essential serenity of genuine temperance. This failure is no accident, but rather an inevitable consequence. The discipline of temperance cannot be realized with a view to man alone. The discipline of temperance, understood as selfless self-preservation, is the saving and defending realization of the inner order of man. For temperance not only preserves, it also defends. Indeed, it preserves by defending. For since the first sin, man has been not only capable of loving himself more than he loves God his Creator, but contrary to his own nature, inclined to do so. The discipline of temperance defends him against all selfish preservation, or selfish perversion of the inner order, through which alone the moral person exists and lives effectively. Wherever forces of self-preservation, self-assertion, self-fulfillment destroy the structure of man's inner being, the discipline of temperance and the license of intemperance enter into play. The natural urge toward sensual enjoyment, manifested in delight in food and drink and sexual pleasure, is the echo and mirror of man's strongest natural forces of preservation. The basic forms of enjoyment correspond to these most primordial forces of being, which tend to preserve the individual man as well as the whole race in the existence for which he was created. Book of Wisdom 1:14. But for the very reason that these forces are closely allied to the deepest human urge toward being, they exceed all other powers of mankind in their destructive violence once they degenerate into selfishness. Therefore, we find here the actual province of temperantia, temperateness and chastity. Intemperateness and unchastity are the primordial forms of the discipline of temperance and the license of intemperance. But we have not as yet fully explored the range of the concept of temperantia. In humility, the instinctive urge to self-assertion can also be made serviceable to genuine preservation, but it can likewise pervert and miss the purpose in pride. And if the natural desire of man to avenge an injustice which he has suffered and to restore his rights explodes in uncontrollable fury, it destroys that which can be preserved only by gentleness and mildness. Without rational self-restraint, even the natural hunger for self-perception or for knowledge can degenerate into a destructive and pathological compulsive greed. This degeneration, or this degradation, Aquinas calls curiositas. The disciplined mode studiositas, curiosity versus study, studiousness. To sum up, chastity, continence, humility, gentleness, mildness, studiositas are modes of realization of the discipline of temperance. Unchastity, incontinence, pride, uninhibited wrath, curiositas are forms of intemperance. Why is it that one reacts with involuntary irritation to these terms, which express the essence of temperance and intemperance, discipline and dissoluteness, since it can hardly be caused by resistance to the good? This irritation must stem from the thick tangle of misinterpretations which covers and smothers each one of these concepts. This mesh of misinterpretations has its roots in a distortion and falsification of man's ideal image, which we can properly term demonic. All the more so since Christians and non-Christians alike regard them as characteristics of the Christian image of man. One more time. This mesh of misinterpretations has its roots in a distortion and falsification of man's ideal image, which we can properly term demonic. All the more so since Christians and non Christians alike regard them as characteristics of the Christian image of man. Worse, the root cause is not just a misconceived image of the good man, but a misconceived view of created reality. Temperamentia is intimately related to the ordered structure of the being of man, in which all gradations of creation unite. As the history of heresy shows, it is quite particular in the sphere of temperamentia that the attitude toward creation and the world is the most incisively decided. The attempt to reconstitute the genuine and original meaning of temperamentia and its various modes of realization must embrace a variety of tasks. It will have to go beyond the strict limits of the subject in order to anchor the true image of this virtue in the fundamentals of Christian teaching concerning man and reality. Figure I'll stop there. It's a good section. Yeah. All right. Yeah. Arceon. That's the beginning of what. Oh man, I do look like I woke up from a nap. Totally did. Yep. Look at that. Yeah. Got that 4:45 shadow. Hair all mussed. All right. Yeah. So I gotta temper my hair. All right. Later.